I first want to welcome all of the guests here, including my A, B, C committee in alphabetical order. Aaron, Bueller, Cuenca. Not everyone gets to say they have that. And
I love it. It's so symmetrical.
And my colleagues, peers here for coming to support. And of course my husband, who will be available to take questions about Chomsky and universal grammar after this defense. He has also been prepared in the dissertation arts of defense. So this is the culmination of a study that I have been working on really for the last 3 years, maybe even a little bit more. And to clarify my terminology, pre-service teachers, I'm referring to teachers who are in the undergraduate part of their education degree, which you're mostly all familiar with. The purpose of the study is to attend to the cases of several Black pre-service teachers, expound on the needs, challenges, and contributions of Black students in teacher education, working with 5 specific Black education majors that were in the program during the time I was doing this study. So I looked at a lot of the research coming in teacher education, trying to figure out what's being written about and who is being written about, who's telling the stories of whom, right? And found that much of this research has to do with the predominantly white teaching or pre-service teacher cohort and also in-service teacher cohort in teacher education. And then the research that was available to look at preparing teachers of color were articles about all teachers of color. So there would be a whole group and they would just call them all teachers of color, kind of sort of a mashup of like, this will work for all people who don't identify as white. And then there were even fewer articles about specifically the preparation of Black pre-service teachers. So that's how I embarked on this. And in my dissertation, I note that I began the study for what I called wrong reasons. And that's a very vulnerable kind of statement that you're not supposed to make in academic circles. But I mean that to say that it was the instinctual, hey, people aren't telling this story. I need to tell this story. And I just sort of embarked on it. And so in that, I mean to say that it wasn't a very well thought out kind of plan when I began. And I didn't understand all of the implications of a white woman telling the stories of Black women at that time. And so while it might be a little overly dramatic to say that I started off with the wrong reasons, I don't think that I'm overstating it too much to say that it was certainly not well thought out in the beginning. And so I understand these implications a lot better. And so basically what I'm looking at in the research is that any kind of literature that's out there is not adequately addressing this insider knowledge that pre-service teachers are supposed to have. Did that just happen?
No, it's
Okay, let's try this again. So professional here. So some of the literature talks about Black pre-service teachers coming in with sort of the almost like instinctive understanding of the Black experience, which may be true, but then the literature is not sort of parsing out what do we do with this kind of insider knowledge and how do we develop it, how are teacher education programs fine-tuning this background knowledge that particularly Black pre-service teachers may come in with. If we're looking at matching the predominantly students of color in preschool through 12th grade with teachers of color, how do we know that this will actually be a good match, and what kind of empirical data do we have to back that up, right? And further, how are Black pre-service teachers prepared? When I was working with the participants in this study, I found that each individual had similar ways of experiencing race, but also a myriad of different experiences that they came with. They all came from different perspectives. They all had different theoretical frameworks. They all had different levels of critical awareness. There were other facets of their identity, such as age, gender, socioeconomic status, and religion that shaped their experience. The other amazing kind of, discovery, which again, it's only discovery because I finally stopped to ask these questions, right, was that when we matched pre-service teachers in these professional development schools, it wasn't necessarily a match of backgrounds because the students all came with different backgrounds. Not all of them had gone to an urban school, which was the assumption in a teacher education program that you must have this experience, you must have gone to an urban school because you're Black, which was not the case, right? And so I just continued to try to look for the different ways in which these pre-service teachers experienced their education, what they brought to the table in terms of their background. There's other people doing this for white teachers. So, for example, Laughter was really looking at the different ways in which white teachers came prepared or not prepared, right? So we're trying to look at the nuance and not just say, all white teachers are this way, right? So this is a similar kind of thing. So my questions kind of changed over the course of this study. I began by asking, how are these students prepared to teach a diverse student population? And that sort of became, did these Black pre-service teachers feel prepared? Because there was no way to sort of quantify, measure how exactly they were prepared, right? And also I'm asking the participants, so it's really their perspective of how they feel prepared. So that kind of changed. And then I began also with the question, what are the lived experiences of Black pre-service teachers? And what kind of morphed in the study was this understanding that they were all experiencing racialization in different ways. That had to do a lot with my questions, so I was sort of focusing on the social construction of race and racial difference in education. But a lot of the ways that we talked about diversity, when I would ask, how do you feel prepared for diversity? A lot of the answers gravitated toward these answers about race, instead of maybe the other ways that we could have defined diversity, right? And so that's kind of how the research took shape. So the methods were interviews. There were 3 or 4 interviews with each participant. They were an average of 50 minutes long. They had approximately, nope, I don't remember what the end of the sentence was going to be. Approximately 18 interviews, 16 hours of audio recordings, about 300 pages of typed transcripts, and then I also kept all of my personal emails and memos. And I tried to be pretty thorough about thinking about the context after the fact and typing that up as well. So it was kind of participant observation in some ways because I was embedded in the teacher education program for a while, but then mostly I relied on that interview data. All of the women were 19 to 22 years old in this particular part of the study. So, and then in terms of the data analysis, I began kind of thinking about these in terms of case studies, but then I slowly began to move, particularly after the proposal defense, to looking at how a narrative took shape. So I think that was a really good suggestion from Dr. Cuenca, and then also started to help make sense of all this data. It was just really overwhelming. When I sat down and I see that I have more than 300 pages of transcripts, and then the personal memos, and so I had my binders and I was organizing everything, but just really overwhelmed. And I just kind of, sat there looking at like, oh my gosh, how am I going to make sense of this, right? So I read it. Eventually I listened again to all of the interviews and took notes and tried to figure out what was really popping out, when the participants were really talking about something with a lot of emotion or, sort of sped up, because you can't see that in the transcripts, right? And that helped. But I think the biggest turning point was when I started to analyze my own trajectory, and I went back even farther, and I started looking at how I began to come up with these questions and the different interactions that I had with different people that sparked the questions. So when I could really see the root of the question and my own story, it helped to add that layer of self-study in, and it helped with understanding what I was looking for, why I was looking for it. So that analysis piece was really helpful, and that's in line with some of the other work that I've done in terms of researcher reflexivity and positionality, like separating out the sense of myself, because inevitably I'm the one who has to analyze it, right? It's through my lens. So that was very helpful. It started to click. I did some tables because it helped to kind of make sense of what I was doing. So this narrative coding process, I tried to look at the different points in the experiences of this pre-service teachers, and it, of course, would coincide with the interview moment, which was over the course of a year and a half or 2 years, depending. And each point, I tried to give a little theme that would sort of encapsulate that moment. And then I took those themes back and checked them with the participants just to ask them, does this kind of encapsulate where you were at this moment? And they all said, yes, that perfectly describes what I was feeling at that time. And I based it off of what they ended up talking about in the interviews, what really kind of had life in it, if that makes sense, sort of this moment when they start talking about something very passionately, right? And so you can see that I also took a major theme for each participant because I wanted to figure out what was the sort of takeaway, what we could learn from each participant. So this is a really hard moment because each person is so different, right? And it's hard to distill someone to a theme. And even it's maybe not ethical to just distill someone to a theme. But again, study, it's a dissertation, you have to say something about, teacher education, right? And so you can sort of see that each student has an arc, and then, so we have Jackie here, she's talking about how she is prepared because of her background. Then later, she's comfortable with both sides. I have a date there because that marks the semester of the Ferguson protests. You don't get taught that in class, but the overriding theme with Jackie in particular was living on both sides, having the experience, and what she means by both sides is feeling comfortable with Black people, feeling comfortable with white people, and that sort of experience growing up. And that's how she describes that she's prepared to teach a diverse student population. Kylie talks a lot about being in and out of a comfort zone, and again, it's on racialized terms. So that's really how our conversations evolved. Jessica, I talk a lot about the process by which she was educated and how that plays in with her understanding of herself, her own dialect, and then how potentially that could come into play when she's teaching in the future. She talks about her own language in very deficit terms, her home language, and she has the experience of also having been part of an interdistrict transfer program into predominantly white suburbs, where eventually she ended up feeling very comfortable, right? Chloe and Shannon were pushed a little bit farther. They were earlier on in the program, and they were sort of radicalized by the experience of Ferguson in that context. But you can really see the trajectory and the movement in their narratives, because they started out sort of talking about, well, diversity is good, but I don't really want to stick out. I don't want to be the Black spokesperson, which was a common theme as well. But in the end, they have more movement towards talking about being an activist, and then also their own understanding of their racial identity and how that's in opposition to the master narrative of the United States. So my theoretical framework was really influenced by critical race theory, but also Black feminist and womanist theories. this is important because critical race theory is a kind of prescriptive framework, of course developed from legal framework, and so you have sort of very hard and fast understanding of race and how it will influence the experiences of different people. Where Black feminist theory is really looking at the perspectives, individual standpoint, and so I feel like the combination of the two is the right sort of tension to bring to what's meant to be a critical study. Thinking in terms of how race will shape the experience, and then yet at the same time thinking about how each person will experience it differently depending on their identity. But specifically valuing and privileging the narratives of Black women. I really appreciated the work of Adrienne Dixon, and she has a phrase, to find what is good. This is from her jazz epistemology. And this, to me, is more than, as Jennifer calls it, the ain't it awful story, right? Of Black students experiencing racism in a predominantly white institution. So I'm trying to look for the potential for resilience, creativity, and strength shown by these young women. I'm resisting the urge to just judge a teacher education program and also look for positive contributions of teachers, courses, and field work as related to me by the participants, as well as the missed opportunities. So in terms of findings, I'm just going to summarize very quickly. It's really important to note that my goal is not to evaluate the teacher education program, but instead to focus on what the participants say about their preparation. So all of the participants reported that they felt generally prepared to teach, and this is important to note. But they all reported that they did not feel prepared to teach a diverse student population by the teacher education program that they were enrolled in. Jackie maintained that her background and racial identity prepared her to meet the needs of children from a variety of backgrounds. Kylie was still working through her discomfort in predominantly white schools, but she said she still felt prepared to teach in a variety of settings because of her life experiences. She also cited one adjunct professor who was Black as her primary mentor in the program, although this teacher was not a permanent fixture in the department. Jessica seemed to be the most overwhelmed by her field work at the urban elementary school, which translated into uneasiness in general about urban schools in general. She felt that she had grown up in two worlds and so therefore would be able to teach a diverse student population, but still expressed an uneasiness about the idea that she might have to teach in an urban school in order to repay her student loans. Chloe and Shannon were not as far along in the teacher education program, so they were less confident overall about feeling prepared to teach. However, they both insisted that teacher education program was not preparing them in terms of diversity or multiculturalism. They relied primarily on their backgrounds and life experiences to inform their teaching philosophies. But they also began to seek out additional resources, and this is actually in line with some of the literature that suggests that in order to get more critical pre-service teachers, that pre-service teachers should in fact go and take courses in the African American Studies program and things like this, right? But in terms of the students that I was working with, they were already maxed out with their course loads, and so it was at great cost to them that they would go and take additional courses in the African American Studies program. But they felt that it was necessary in order to sort of supplement their education that they were getting in the teacher education program. I considered Chloe and Shannon to be the most prepared to engage in discussions about systemic inequity and racism, even as they expressed feeling unprepared. But on the other hand, the other participants felt fairly confident in their ability to teach culturally diverse student population, yet they still seemed to have problematic beliefs about race and racial identity. But also should be noted that Chloe and Shannon were the only ones to take part in the Occupy movement that was happening on the campus. And they also were, like I said, earlier on in the program, and so I'm trying to look at the possibility that the earlier you are in a program, maybe you are more receptive to things that are going on outside the campus. And of course you can't make a generalization because I'm only working with 5 students, but it's just really interesting to see that they were the ones who were catalyzed by that moment, whereas the other students weren't, and even were on campus but seemed to basically avoid what was going on. So getting to my positionality, yes, I'm white. So this has been an area of research for me over the last couple of years, trying to look at who should do research about whom. And we talk about that in terms of teaching, right? Who's a match for the students that we have? If we have black students, should we have a black teacher? And these sorts of questions. And the same kind of discussion goes on in research. If we have black participants, should we have a black researcher? If we have white participants, should we have a white researcher? So all of these kinds of discussions have been part of my thinking over the course of the last couple of years. And the answer is, there is no answer, actually. Many different people have different opinions, first of all. And then secondly, when you come at it with like a post-structural sort of vision, if you're saying that this person must do research with this person, you say that this person is a fixed variable, essentially, that this person will always equal this quantifiable outcome, when that's not the case. Individuals are just vastly complex and come with all kinds of different experiences, and what happens in each individual interaction is going to be vastly different from one moment to the next, right? And so there's just no way to confine people. And so in that sense, there is no right or wrong person. But I will say that working as a white researcher with black participants, I became very aware of my limitations on several levels. So first of all, when we're talking about critiquing internalized racism in black pre-service teachers, the fact that I'm white and complicit in a white dominated institution makes it very problematic for me to critique the internalized racism of a black pre-service teacher. So it's not to say that we can never have these conversations, and in fact we did have sort of conversations about, well, why do you perceive African American English to be deficit or improper? And sort of, went back and forth and asked questions and had heart-to-heart conversations. But at the same time, for me to just unilaterally say, well, obviously you're miseducated and you've internalized this racism is just not authentic, right? Because I'm complicit in this system. And there's also a difference for me as a white teacher educator to point out these inconsistencies and address them with teacher educators. There are different moments when this just doesn't work, and in fact it would be more authentic and more well received to have somebody else who's experienced that same lived experience. I will say, from my perspective, I feel that all the participants were generally well prepared to teach. So as a teacher educator, I can look at them and say, generally speaking, I think you'll be a good teacher. And even more so, they display resilience in the face of adversity. They struggled with finances. They overcame these different odds. They all expressed empathy towards marginalized students, including students of color, students living in poverty, and English language learners. And Adrienne Dixon calls this sort of mother wit, or this, we talked about earlier, insider knowledge. And I don't think that should be downplayed, because the idea that you go into teaching with empathy towards black students is huge, considering that we have other research to show that the mostly white pre-service teacher, in-service teacher can be unsympathetic to black students. So I think that that is very important. But what my critique is the teacher education program did not have enough spaces where this experiential knowledge could be expanded and refined. And there were also no black mentors, or very few black mentors, who could challenge the problematic views that participants held about black students, African American English, and even poverty. Have you seen this commercial? This is my meme. If you insist on the PowerPoint, I will give you a meme. So have you seen the commercial where this woman is trying to do Facebook, but she does Facebook on her actual physical wall, right? And then at some point they say, that's not how it works. That's not how any of this works. So this is sort of how I felt about this juxtaposition between the teacher education literature and what I'm meant to be looking at, which is essentially how are teacher educators changing their dispositions. And essentially, along with the research prior to my study, teacher education is not substantially changing the dispositions of pre-service teachers. And so, in fact, it begs the question, what are we doing, right? And why, if at all, should we even focus on dispositions? Or, right? So there's just this disconnect here. Identity was also huge. So finding out who you are as a teacher, of course, there's a trajectory in terms of becoming a teacher. And I also argue that it's linked to their identity in terms of racial identity. That it's linked to their stance as an educator, the kind of educator they're going to be. That there are arcs in the development of racial identity, but they also sort of coincide with the arcs in the development to become a teacher. So we should look at the background of each individual student regardless of and because of racial identity. Major finding for me, dun dun dun, we need Black teacher educators. I really wanted to do a hashtag in my dissertation and I didn't, but here's the hashtag on the PowerPoint. This is perhaps the biggest implication of this study is that I am yet another white woman telling stories of Black pre-service teacher educator, Black pre-service teachers, teacher educator telling stories of the pre-service teachers. And there are examples in the dissertation about why this became particularly salient, but we substantially have not done anything in teacher education to address this systemic issue. And there are so many things I think we're missing because of that. And then finally, one more meme. Colorblindness is not actually a thing. Recognizing that people have different lived experiences depending on skin tone is one way to combat white supremacy. Ruth Frankenberg had a book called White Women, Race Matters. And so the culmination of this is that white teacher educators, race matters. We need to understand the limitations of our positionality as white women, specifically white teacher educators. We need to incorporate the voices of Black educators, but in addition, we need to incorporate actual Black teacher educators, not just their voices, right? And the goal should be to create agents of change in our pre-service teacher population. So, in conclusion, addressing the dispositions of pre-service teachers must be accompanied by an acknowledgement of their dynamic and varied identities. This requires that teacher educators pay attention to what pre-service teachers bring with them in terms of life experiences, which in itself is an enactment of culturally relevant and critical care. When the students go out in schools, the coursework should center around helping the pre-service teachers frame their experiences. They need to learn to think critically, seeing the underlying values in the schools they visit in order to form a critique of the status quo. In addition, a multiracial coalition of teacher educators will be more effective in teaching topics of racial identity development, which I hold should be central to teacher education. So that, in a nutshell, is a summary of what you have already read, and so I hope to have a discussion with you. Yes? Did I hit my time?
Thank you. 10:29.
Awesome.
All right, let's open the floor for questions. Either of you like to start? Because I've been closest in on this of late.
So wanted to get a sense, what you didn't share but was pretty prominent in your work, was the role of Mariah and second text. And so can you tell me a little bit, I know you wrote about it, but I'd like to kind of hear your thoughts on the influence of her work on your arc as a researcher, but also, I don't know, how different do you think your study would have turned out without her voice in your work?
There could have been a couple of different outcomes. One of the outcomes might have been that she would have said she would be a participant, because initially I was trying to recruit her as a participant. And in that case, I think the work would have been very different, because I still would have thought of the ways in which I could analyze the trajectory of the pre-service teachers, sort of almost trying to quantify. Again, we're in qualitative research, and yet we're trying to put people in sort of boxes or themes, right? So, first of all, the fact that she refused to be a participant and said, no, instead I'd like to write with you and to constantly critique you. I mean, to the point, like, you should not be doing this work. And I felt like that was so valuable because it made me constantly go back and think about why I was doing the work. I had to really dig deep and not just to defend myself, and I mean, in the end, you have to finish the dissertation, right? At some point, you can't just turn around and stop. But I think that it made me really, really dig deep in terms of the data analysis. So that moment when I was sitting in front of all of these transcripts and I was just so stuck, really stuck, like, how am I going to even make sense of this? And what I did was I went back, and really it was my relationship with Mariah. So I had 2 years of documented material from our interactions. So I didn't record anything, but I would just take notes and kind of think about what we talked about. What we talked about essentially shaped the questions of the study. She and I were co-constructing the study because I was interested from the research end of things. She was interested from an experiential perspective, like she's actually going through the program. And so we just developed these questions, and as I saw that, I was able to then talk about that this is really where the study came from. It wasn't, so in that sense, it wasn't just like me pulling out little ideas from my head and look at me going to save the world. There was really a co-construction of this knowledge, this understanding, and I was trying to come at it from the researcher's side. And so then at some point, I realized I couldn't tell the story without including her at some level, and so I just kept pushing, and honestly, it was pretty hard to feel like somebody doesn't want to participate, and yet I'm pushing and saying, no, I really want your voice. What can we do to make the voice go in a way you will feel comfortable with? And when we found, or you introduced me to the second text idea, where a student teacher or pre-service teacher basically goes through and comments on the work, and then it goes in as sort of a bracketed quote, but with the real name, or I don't know, that study may have had pseudonyms, but in any case, she insisted on using her real name, and I was able to show her that her voice would go in unedited, that whatever she contributed would be the narrative alongside mine. Whatever she wanted to say, I would not alter it, I wouldn't go back and analyze it, that it would just stand. And so then I think at some point she felt okay with that. And I think it really does help because, I think her voice has been the voice in the back of my head the whole way. Not only in terms of experience, but also in terms of critique. And her critique has been echoed by other people. I was just presenting a professional development session last week, and it was a diverse graduate student population of public school teachers, and there were maybe half were African American. And I introduced myself, and I told them my dissertation topic, and instantly I got some faces in the back. Just real side-eye, and so I stopped and I said, can you let me know what you're thinking? And one of the teachers said, why did you study that, right? So I actually stopped my presentation and went into a whole discussion about why, which essentially is I stumbled on this literature, I got on this path, and then before I knew it, I was in the middle of it. Not in a way to say, it wasn't my fault, I just, but in a way to say that, I didn't realize the implications of this when I started, and so now I do, and now I'm trying to do it as carefully as possible as a white woman.
One more question. So can you tell me, how did you see the theory, so the critical race theory and the kind of the feminist humanist theory, play out in the findings and narratives? Because I feel like you kind of seem to drop that. So you give us a good kind of theoretical orientation, and then you give us the narrative, and then you kind of lost that in the actual implications, conclusions. So can you tell me a little more about kind of that connection? The implications of those two theories based on the narratives that you found for teacher education.
So in terms of critical race theory, if we're going to go back to kind of the legal perspective, which I think is important because it's where it came from. In terms of critical race theory, whiteness as property was potentially the largest kind of theme or finding. The idea that the university in which the pre-service teachers, black pre-service teachers were enrolled, had a prestige attached to it that in addition had some not only social cachet but real financial implications in terms of where they could get hired later. That came out in a big way. It came out actually more with one of the students who I had to sort of bracket as a pilot study. So that potentially can be an area of future study or future, publications. Because this student in the pilot study particularly was adamant about her choice to switch from a historically black college across the road from Catholic University. And her choice was based primarily on the idea that she wanted to get a good job. And she says, white people do it better. So, without getting into that analysis too much, there's this belief that this is a predominantly white institution and therefore it will have monetary implications. And even some beliefs, that potentially could be internalized racism, right? So the idea of whiteness as property, I think, could have been brought out a little bit more. I think that my resistance to that in the analysis had to do with focusing more on their perspectives, their lived experience. So I think in the end, my analysis ended up shifting more towards black feminist theory, looking at how their positionality shaped the way that they saw their preparation. But there's more that could be brought out in terms of critical race theory.
And in terms of, so I was a little unclear. I mean, I think in moments in your presentation you said the students felt prepared enough to teach. But then at other moments I think you were mentioning that there were still some deficit orientations toward poverty.
Yeah.
So given that you're using, one a gendered, the intersection of race and gender in one theory and
right.
a purely race theory on the other, to which one of those two streams are you attributing that not enoughness or that deficit from that standpoint of those student teachers?
So the deficit analysis would probably be more attributed to critical race theory, and then also this studies that have looked at pre-service teachers and how they conflate race with poverty, that they don't have the tools they need in order to sort of parse that out and talk about what they mean when they say poverty, what they mean when they say black student, urban schools, right? All of those things become sort of mixed up together. Could you repeat the question? What was the beginning of the question?
To which stream are you attributing that, theoretically? I mean, you're making a claim that these students have some kind of deficit in that perspective, and because you've been reticent to assign blame to the program itself for not providing that, what's left is the individual identity of the pre-service teacher. So is this a racialized deficit? Is it a gender deficit? Which one of those, where is that perspective coming from?
Sure. I think then that goes exactly back to critical race theory again. So we're looking at the idea that racism is not just individual bias, that it's a whole system, that it's endemic in our society, that we've been all socialized in that perspective. And so that particular critique, again, I'm hesitant to make the critique, but the critique is that there are deficit views held by the pre-service teachers that come from their education in this society. Not necessarily, or not only, the teacher education program. I think that what I'm saying in the dissertation anyway is that the teacher education program did little to disrupt those internalized views, but the internalized views were a product of growing up in the United States, growing up in a white supremacist society. So that's a definite critical race critique.
Awesome.
So one of the things I think is interesting is when thinking about pre-service teachers, their students walk here, right? But
Right.
often they're always like vacillating between this like they can't see themselves as students, or they see themselves too much as students, right? Like they're
Right,
going
sure.
back and forth, which is sort of like, do pre-service teachers know if they're prepared to be a good teacher? Can they even answer that, right?
Sure.
Did they talk, or did you hear their voices as Black students at SLU? So not as preparing to be Black teachers, but did they talk about what it meant to be a Black student at SLU, like in informal spaces, and like thinking of college student development, like social spaces?
Yeah.
What it felt like to be a developing college-age student. Sometimes I think all of our students don't see their own development as a student when they're
Sure.
in a teacher prep program, because they're so focused on the kids that will be in their classroom.
I
But
think
that's obviously related to their identity.
Right. No, I think a lot of the conversations centered around how they experienced the class or the cohort that they would go through depending on their program. A lot of it had to do with my class has a lot of cliques, or every time I raise my hand, everybody looks at me and wants to know if this is what all Black people think. And that was a similar kind of narrative to other kinds of literature about the experience of Black students in a predominantly white institution. So the idea that I have to figure out who my friends are, I have to figure out how to speak up in class, I have to figure out, who I can talk to with whom. Those kinds of student-centered issues came out because I was also asking, what's your experience in the classes? So, the classes were primarily education classes, and they were talking about how to prepare, or, how to be prepared as a future teacher. But they were talking about the interactions that they were having with the other students and how that played out in either racialized terms or sometimes even socioeconomic terms. So the one student who talked about consistently being required to take other students to the fieldwork sites, like carpooling. So, we're all in this together, we're all in this class, we have this fieldwork requirement, which is typical at SLU anyway. If you're not education, you have service learning and these kinds of things. And the student had a car, and no one ever reimbursed her for it. And the student was in a really precarious financial situation, as were actually most of the students. And there's no discussion, no explicit discussion from the professor about how to reimburse each other. And she said, I don't feel like I can talk about that because I don't feel like they'll relate, even though she's the one who had the car and the other students didn't. It was similar to her experience growing up as a student in elementary school when she said, or middle school, when she said that their house was in the suburbs, but it was federally subsidized and they didn't have heat for a whole winter or two. And she said, I couldn't talk about that because I didn't feel like the white students would understand. So, she's conflating racial experience with socioeconomic experience, and it seems to be mirrored then later in the predominantly white institution as,
Right, so there's an assumption of privilege in our teacher education, our Catholic University's teacher education program.
Right.
That would be experienced, which is a way that we're reinforcing not coming at things from an equity lens, right?
Exactly.
So then, and that assumption is not just, I think, of privilege, but also like shared past experiences. So
Sure.
I'm wondering about the social, like the informal spaces, the conversations that happen in the hallway, not necessarily the curriculum, but the assumption of we all know this, we refer to this, those like shared like cultural references and ways of connecting with other people as like a college student,
Sure.
not in the classroom, but like, not living with mom and dad anymore, maybe,
Sure.
and like being like how did that shape their experience?
Most of the students said they explicitly did not hang out with the other education students. There was one in particular who said that her circle was based on the social groups that she was, or the clubs. So she was part of the Rainbow Alliance. She was part of the dance club or step club or something like that. And she said those were her social circles. Another student said she hung out with her boyfriend, and she hung out with the other black student from the education department, and then mostly hung out with other people because she was an RA, different people on campus. Another student said, I don't hang out with those other people. I don't go to the education club because they're all cliquey, and it's the same clique as in my class that goes to the club, the education club, and they all talk about each other, and so I have my one friend, and that's it. And then, one of them didn't even mention who she hung out with. I have a feeling she didn't hang out with the students. She was the one that was giving them rides. So yeah, and by and large, this did not bleed over into social situations.
So what does that do? I mean, I'm just asking this out loud. Like, if we think about the social development that happens for people in a space like a college experience, it's almost like there's a stunting of, like, you're in limbo, right? When you're a black student at a primarily white institution. I'm just thinking a lot about that.
Again, with the critical race perspective and thinking about whiteness as property and thinking about whiteness as actual cash or a, capital, right? All of the students, maybe with the exception of one, her parent worked at the university and therefore she was getting, the tuition deal or whatever. But almost without exception, they talked about the choice to go to Catholic University as a monetary and privileged move. And there, for example, there was one student who said, my dad wanted me to go to a historically black university, and I said, no, I've always gone to predominantly black high school or whatever. I want to be comfortable around white people. It's not right that I am this age, 18 years old, and I'm not comfortable around white people. And so it's a very strategic move, not in the sense of like, I want to go make white friends, which I'm not putting a judgment on that, but the point was, this is a capital move. This is a strategic networking, and not about the friendship per se, but about what I can gain from my proximity to whiteness, my comfort level with whiteness, which I understand to be, she wasn't articulated that way, but it was, essentially understanding as a privileged power structure. I'm trying to think about the other. There's another student that wanted to go here, I think primarily because of the Catholic orientation, and she had a specific scholarship to work with a Catholic cohort afterwards. But again, then this is something I didn't end up getting into. It showed up later in the interviews when I was already finished mostly talking about, I was trying to wrap up basically. But she started talking about her identity as a queer woman. And so that shaped the way that she socialized on campus and who she socialized with. So yeah, I see that as very intertwined with this idea of whiteness as power or property or social cachet.
Good. Okay. Go ahead, Alex. Go ahead.
Can I ask why you, I guess, shied away from critiquing the program itself? That was a deliberate move on your part. You said it, you read about it.
Yeah, I felt from the beginning that any attempt to critique the program would be met by too much opposition, and I didn't feel that I could, so I was making claims based on my own experience, and I don't know, perhaps I felt that couldn't be included as data. In the end, I included myself as data. I included my own perspective, and that was to help make sense of why I came up with these questions and things like that. Perhaps I felt that I couldn't really adequately back my claims without outing people or...
to me, the beauty of narrative, so the idea that the enacted curriculum in teacher education is the experiences of these students.
Right.
Is teacher education.
Right.
Like teacher education isn't a set of coursework
No, sure,
or
right.
a building.
Right.
It is actually these set of experiences.
Right.
And that then gives you some leverage to say something about teacher education
Sure.
that perhaps is rarely voiced, especially as explicitly as it is in this
Yeah.
dissertation. And so, I think that was the one thing that I was having trouble with is this idea of I don't know why you kind of took the program with kitty gloves and said, I'm going to just sit and lean on the experiences and retell the experiences.
Instead of my own judgment, basically.
Well, their judgment.
Their judgment.
No, right.
Yeah, so you're basically leveraging their voices and saying this
Sure.
is what they're saying about. So even when you have the way you were answering Lauren's question about the experiences within the classroom, that is teacher education.
Right,
What we're
sure.
doing
No,
there
right.
is
No,
educating
right.
discursively students, explicitly or implicitly, about what it takes to be a teacher and what teacher education ought to be. And that is a narrative that now you've been able to surface.
Sure.
But then it has to say something, because I think what you've done is basically just said, and this is what they said.
Sure. Well, right. I mean, the findings and the conclusion, talking about dispositions, talking about identity, and then talking about the lack of black teacher educators. I mean, so that, without getting any more specific from my own experience in the program, that is the critique, that this particular program, programs in general, are not changing dispositions or interrupting internalized, deficit beliefs.
But that's an argument that we're getting about white and black teachers. So your study was about black teachers.
Right.
So what are they telling you specifically about that slice of identity through their stories?
They're critiquing the curriculum, the pedagogy of the teachers here, and the culture of the school of
Sure.
education. Basically. I should say that.
It's there, and I think that's.
Say more, Lauren, about where you see their explicit critiques that Lauren hasn't fully amplified.
I mean, she has in terms of talking about their experience in the class, but she then doesn't say so. The curriculum had got. I mean, they have specific examples of where they're taught have snacks in your desk or whatever. All these different things, and you have several different examples of that, and then also the pedagogy, right? looking to a black teacher to represent their race, right? So that's bad teaching, right? So they're experiencing in ineffectual curriculum, bad teaching, and they're also in a culture where they don't feel where they're clustering with other black students because socially they don't feel supported. And I think you know all of those things, right? But you don't need to say, I, Lauren, know this. They're telling you that.
Right.
And so I think at the end to hit that, do it.
Yeah, and I think part of it's because I think you've been so vulnerable that I think you've been just a little bit reticent to make the sharp critique claims. But I think you either do it one of two ways. I think you either do it through the voices of the participants, which I think you've been honest and trying to honor that through the entire dissertation, or through the theory itself. It's both of us are telling us the same thing, except now you have the voice to back up the theory and substantiate it a little more.
The critical race analysis is definitely an area that I dropped, but so it's interesting to hear that feedback because so I think that there are different levels of critique. So I feel like at some level this would be a hard critique for some people, or this would feel like a very sharp critique, right? And then from a different perspective, as you're saying, it doesn't feel like a sharp critique. I don't know if I'm articulating that.
You're saying depending
You're
on who
thinking
the
of the
reader
audience,
is,
yeah.
who the audience is, this
Well, I mean,
may or
you're-
may not come across as a sharp critique.
Right. I mean, you're the audience, essentially. I mean, the first audience in any case. But right. I mean, for some people, I think it would be a critique. Right. But go ahead.
I
Yes.
feel like you're self-conscious because you came in critical and then were afraid that you were reinforcing your own criticality. Do you know what I mean, of the program?
Oh, sure.
And I appreciated that. I remember in your oral, we're like,
No, right.
Right. But I think now you're too self-conscious about that.
Yes. Agreed.
And I think that a gap-filled curriculum for pedagogy and a culture, social culture at a school of education that doesn't fully support Black students is kind of ubiquitous too. It's not radical for you to say that.
And right, and,
Sure,
and,
sure,
and
sure,
right,
sure.
and I think to the spirit of what you've been trying to accomplish this whole time, you're not telling me anything about teacher preparation.
Mm.
You know, there's nothing that you're contributing to in a sense we don't know.
Well, you do when you talk. but
When
not-
you talk, no, of course, right, yeah, and I think in informal conversations we've had these, I think you know them. You kind of really reined it in here, and before it used to be perhaps unsubstantiated or unwarranted because they were just your thoughts or your own personal experiences. I think now you have the combination both of yours and I think the careful study. I think that's what the process is supposed to do. It's supposed to refine your thinking. So the second text, the way that you talk so thoroughly about your own methodology and your own care and trying to like weave theory together. Now you're able to stand firmly and say something that you know I couldn't or anyone else could because you've done the study and you've done it well.
So let me ask a clarifying question around that, and then let me ask a couple of things that I've been thinking about. So if you guys are suggesting and, in fact, calling for a stronger and more direct, targeted critique. So within Chapter 5, as Lauren was just saying, she's laid out some familiar critiques, as you said, none of which are revelatory, because we are very aware of the problems in teacher ed nationwide. So she's kind of got the arc of those critiques, and they're themed and sectioned. Do you all envision, like rhetorically, in terms of the layout of that chapter, another section, another layer that goes right in on Catholic University? Or do you envision more of a reframing of the findings?
No, I mean, pragmatically, I think it's a section. I don't think it's. I mean, I
Okay.
think she's done a really strong job
Okay.
of weaving through it. This is my opinion. I think it's a section in the back of the chapter that tries to process all of those things. Looks at the the lived experience. When you're going back to the initial question that you had, the lived experience of the curriculum of teacher education. It's not as broad as you had it set up, but that lived experience of the and what it means and what's distinct about it for Black pre-service teachers.
Mm-hmm. And really, we've surfaced some of that material already. We've done some pre-writing. It's this social marginalization is profound,
Right.
and the poor pedagogy is profound. And so
Especially because you're teaching teachers.
she's given three. Lauren had, it was a 3-part critique so far: gap-filled curriculum, poor pedagogy, and social marginalization.
Sure.
So we can say more. There are 2 other little elements that I've been very interested in throughout that I don't think we've talked about yet. One is the role of outside experiences that, as you called it, can puncture equilibrium. I really like that phrase. So that's a different kind of gap, right? That they're having these lived experiences outside of class, which kind of ties into Lauren's question about the social experience of being in college and identity development. And then the element of care that was so powerful and prominent through the womanist lens that you brought, we could argue that care was grossly lacking in this program. And care is not foregrounded in many places,
Right.
but you called for it theoretically, or it was something that theoretically informed how you took up their narratives.
Sure.
So in terms of like the structure of the critique, the 3 parts that Lauren raised, and then I'm interested in hearing more about whether these 2 could also be a part of that critique, or how that
the outside lived experiences be part of the social culture. Because I'm thinking of the things in terms of you have for a reason Ferguson as a kind of punctured point.
Right.
So and the way that the school frames those outside events, right? So things that happen on campus and how whether it's school leadership or the actual faculty in the classrooms speaking or not speaking to that is going to influence those teachers' feelings in terms of how they're experiencing that. And that's almost the how long have you been in the program, right? So if your level of trust because you've been with faculty for 4 years or 3 years, or you're embedded in the culture.
Right.
When they're not speaking about it,
Right.
you're not going to go seek it out,
Right.
Because this is my space where I'm home. I'm trying to
Sure.
strategize and capitalize off my experiences here. Why would I jeopardize that?
Right.
Whereas if I'm newer in the program, I may not be as enculturated that I need to kind of walk the walk that the people in my school are doing.
Right.
I might be free to go explore
Yeah.
what's happening.
Or if you've just become completely disenchanted
Right.
with the whole system, like Mariah was saying, then
And you're strategizing. I just need to get out.
Exactly. So yeah, so her narrative, I think, helped push me as well, because she was much farther along in the program, and yet she took a leadership role in different events, and was actually mentoring younger Black pre-service teachers and things like that. So, right, it did boil down to how much the pre-service teacher had sort of assimilated or acculturated to
the school
to the
education.
right.
Did I hear you right, Lauren? You were saying something about time as a factor here in analyzing their lived experience of the program, that the farther along, her data
she
is,
said that,
She
yeah.
said that, yeah.
your data allows us to see that the farther along you are, in some ways, the more you have, essentially the more you have to lose by engaging in critique. So the level of complacency or distancing or self-protection increases.
Yeah, if they're viewing it as a strategic, kind of, why would I, after 3 years of paying tuition and getting A's or doing whatever, and I'm on my spot, why would I
Right.
jeopardize that?
And
Right.
And with the two younger participants, I met them, I think, the end of their freshman year or at the beginning of their sophomore, I can't remember, but very early on, and we were already starting to have conversations. So even the fact that I was asking these questions, I haven't really looked at like what the impact of that would have been.
Maybe they didn't know that they couldn't critique yet, right? Like, so a freshman might not have learned that yet.
Well, what I'm saying is, though, our conversations already started to move towards a critique in the beginning.
Right,
And-
so that's might have framed
And that may have
shaped their
begun
experience.
to actually shape the whole. I mean, I'm not saying that I like impacted them
No.
completely, but
Certainly.
but there was one person at least who was asking the questions: how are you be prepared for diverse student populations, so that by the time this student was a junior, she was saying to me, "I'm so glad I have you to talk to, and this is really great when we meet because we talk about all these things." That she was increasingly becoming aware of. Of course, again, radicalized by the Occupy movement on campus. So that particular student was an RA and was really stuck between the university policies for RAs and her own beliefs that even went in juxtaposition with her parents' understanding of what was going on. So she was adopted by white parents. So yeah, I mean, that layer is something I think I was really hesitant to make claims with because it's such a small population. And so, feeling used to the quantitative paradigm where you should have substantial population before you can make, these generalizing statements. But anyway, but I allude to it. I don't know. I felt like that was pretty radical.
In terms of, you roll out findings, you make critiques, and then you're meant to offer solutions. What ideas do you have about how teacher ed might better take up the outside experiences that are shaping, especially since this data and much of the rest of the literature shows that we don't change dispositions? And yet when dispositions were changing in this set of participants, it was because of what happened outside.
Right.
Do you have any ideas on how teacher educators could be more strategic and intentional about attending to that dimension of their development?
So what I talked about in the dissertation had to do with suggestions that are already out there, which is to incorporate work around racial identity, to open up these discussions in class, to have teacher educators who are prepared to talk about these issues, who actually are, have more knowledge than the students. And well, I mean, right? Like you have to, in order to lead in order to lead a conversation. I mean, race, socioeconomic status, gender, class, all of these kinds of socially constructed concepts are really tricky, and we've been socialized to not talk about them. And so, in order to be able to talk about them effectively, teacher educators need to be prepared for that. And I think that having that ability will open up the space for when outside events happen. First of all, because you'll have instructors who are critically minded and who will understand the social dimensions of what's going on and not just make snap judgments about whatever the news articles are saying. But again, I go back to, I appreciate that we consistently say, how can we as a majority white teacher educator cohort do better to educate all students, but in particular the most marginalized students, Black resource teachers, or in different states it would be like Latino or Asian, right? But again, without diverse experience in terms of the teacher educators, we're still going to essentially be stuck in the ways of thinking and talking about these issues, because a white teacher educator will fundamentally have a different way of processing and going through society and experiencing a situation like Ferguson. It just fundamentally impacts a white person in a different way. No matter how radical the white person, this particular issue of police brutality towards people of color impacts white people in a different way than it does for people of color. And so the idea that we as white, majority white teacher educators can adequately speak to these societal issues is just, we're really just perpetuating the same old. And it's just, at some point, somebody has to say, we really have to diversify our teacher education, our teacher educator population. We really believe that this is a really big thing. And I think until that happens, I think there's still just a sort of an echo chamber kind of situation.
But for the program, there was no discursive shock that Ferguson created, right? I mean, you talked through the way that your participants experienced Ferguson.
No, not necessarily. I mean, there were some positive things. I mean, like, one aspect that came out was this teacher educator named Andrea, who is...
Stop it.
No, I'm not kidding. I'm actually not kidding. So I went in with a very, critical lens, expecting to find no critical outlets. And the students kept coming back to a school and community class. All of them, at some point, had taken it with the same instructor, and it became a flashpoint. It became, even for the ones who were all the way at the end and sort of like, no, I love this program and whatever, they were saying things at the very end like, no, but this class we talked about this, and that was the first time, and I'm really glad we did. Or, in this class we actually had a substantial amount of students of color. So you start to hear some of that, take that, white teacher educator program. So I think, again, finding what is good is looking for also the things that I found that were unexpected, which were little spaces for people to talk.
But you started your response to Jennifer's question that all of the recommendations that I listed are already well documented in the literature, which is why you have to come harder at this program. Because if we already know what you should be doing, then it's unconscionable that it's not being done.
Oh, sure.
That's why, we don't want to, I appreciate you not wanting to be petty, which I know you're self-conscious about because you have personal experience, right? So you're always like, am I just being...
And you also told me not to be petty,
right?
Explicitly.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, we had that conversation. Because it's not, you have every right to feel that way.
Yeah.
But I think, if we already know all this,
it's
then
malpractice.
It's
educational
so then
malpractice.
Say that. Yeah, absolutely. There has to be, and I think you say it at the very end.
Yeah, this is your conclusion.
Yeah.
Mm. But I'm trying to go out on a limb, Lauren. You and me. You already leading the way. But think, you're going further out on a limb, Lauren, and you're used to going out on limbs. And as your guide.
Sometimes they break.
Mm-hmm.
And, the people you're critiquing probably won't make it to the end, so.
And your limb is backed up.
Yeah.
Your limb is backed up
Right.
by 159 pages.
Yeah.
It's not a, not a flimsy limb.
And what
Or
you're
that
saying
one
is
thing
not
that-
actually radical.
Right.
What you're saying is not radical.
it's really interesting, Lauren, because you're going to roll this out into articles. You are. And coming harder at the program is a part of that, right? Like, let's just think about this. So in the short term, you're going to add a section to Chapter 5. And that's pretty straightforward. But just thinking in terms of, like, when we take this to the next level, right? When you finesse it and nuance it and now shrink it down to its distilled essence, article length, I just want to think collectively about how the taking up your suggestion, how that's gonna make the outside world contribution that a scholarly article then is prepared to make, how it's gonna intensify that.
I mean, I think we're going to, what you're unearthing with the narrative itself is the unique contribution to the field. In that we generally don't have this kind of conversation in teacher education with the subset of the population that you're studying.
Say that again, Alex.
The unique contribution is the design of the study, in a sense. I feel that anyone who is, and this is my orientation to research sometimes, but I feel anyone who's thought about having students of color in their teacher education classroom has at least thought about the possibilities of what you're finding. I think what you're basically is just now putting it out there as a finding, as something that we can now refer back to. 3 things, 4 things, 5 things that we can refer back to in terms of potentially what Black police service teachers might be engaging in or feeling in or understanding or seeing within their programs. But I think to do that, you have to have a conscious critique of the program. You can't just let the students, let that hang. That they're saying something about the program based on their experience. They might not be saying it directly, but they're saying it through their experience, and their experience is the program. So as long as you make that connection, that it's an enacted curriculum, that then you're in fair game to critique the program, because it is.
Let's linger on that for a minute. Do we hear what he just said? The idea, like, you're very devoted to honoring their voices and not putting words in their mouth and not trying to manipulate them based on petty prior experience, right, or grievances. Okay. And they might not make the critique directly. That's what I'm hearing.
No, they're not.
Because they're saying, in general, I paid a lot of money to come to Catholic U. I'm relatively well prepared. But the enacted and experienced part, which for some of them may still be subconscious. Like, they may be telling you about being marginalized, being the recipient of poor pedagogy and a gap-filled curriculum, but they haven't yet escaped the student identity far enough to be able to look back and critique it.
Sure.
Is that a fair
and
statement?
back to Lauren's point, which is like, I may not know what it means to be a good teacher because I'm going through the process.
Say I'm
So,
well prepared.
so the best I can give you is stories. I'll give you stories about the way that I've been prepared.
Sure.
And then as the researcher, then you get to make sense of those stories and then tell us something about, given that you know the literature the way it ought to be, and make that evaluation and comparison.
I think you turn this into an article, and any teacher educator who has any criticality is just going to be head nodding all the time.
Right.
They're not going to be like, how dare she make these?
Right.
I mean, they're going to say, that's right.
Sure.
Yep.
Yeah. I think what you'll have to hang on to, article length, is the fidelity to the process, which we proved that you could do master's degree there, which is the methodology and the richness of your research, and even I would have to think about it a little more carefully, but thinking about the way to incorporate Mariah's second text and what that meant. I mean, talking through that positionality. I think there's some richness to your study that I think will be valued, and then the findings, I think, then fall into place.
Do you have any questions or response before we wrap up?
I think the idea of getting this into a manageable article length is intimidating, and how to kind of slice it up, and I don't know, it's just could be just fatigue at this moment.
It is.
It is.
Let's all just agree about that.
But yeah, Right.
Yeah, and I think moving forward, you maybe look at the different stories, and you don't necessarily have to tell all 6 or 7 of them
Yeah,
together.
yeah.
You can say 2 of them,
Right, right,
and
right.
figure out thematically how those are grouped together, and
Right.
then say something.
Right.
And depending on the way in which you want to critique the program, if you're taking kind of Lauren's 3-prong approach, you may just want to think about the stories that tell you about the social climate
Sure,
in the program,
sure.
and think about writing specifically to what research tells us around the social construction of teacher preparation. And then what these 2 students are contributing based on these stories and what they're telling us about that. And then the next article can be about pedagogy. And so looking at whose stories kind of spoke more clearly about pedagogy and thinking about kind of breaking those things down and then saying something specific about pedagogy and then from there. So you can think about it that way too. You don't necessarily do all 6 at the same time. You can kind of group them and cluster them. But it's going to be a little bit of a deconstruction of the way that you already built
Sure.
the dissertation.
Yeah, right.
But that's for later.
But those are really smart and savvy. Just think, like, it's still overwhelming, of course, but those are very savvy and manageable. It's taking this and making bite-sized chunks out of it, right? It's taking that whole menu and saying, okay, just here's the dinner plate slice, here's the lunch plate slice. And it's, as you know, the masterful people at this would say, it's deploying the data in these very intentional, strategic ways just to shine a light on this slice at this moment. And there are other pieces to shine a light on, but you can't shine a light on all of them in one article. So this is really helpful. All right. I think we're ready to convene as a committee. So
Sure.
for the guests, and Lauren would step outside for just a few minutes.